if you do the typical mortgage route to gaining a house, well then basically the shadow that is thrown over you involves the mortgage, and then you actually are tied to a growth system. So a lot of the chapter is actually explaining not just that, but also aspects of housing being a contributor to global environmental use. For instance, around 30% of global carbon emissions can be attributed to housing. And that's not just the embodied energy and materials in housing when they're constructed, but more particularly their operating costs. And as the global financial crisis showed, housing and construction are key drivers of economies, and often economies boom and bust according to the cycle of housing. So, just mention very quickly this book that I wrote, Small is Necessary, Shared Living on a Shared Planet, and that was basically about growing per capita housing space, especially in countries such as Australia, the United States, and certain other countries where households have been shrinking over the 20th century, but developers are offering houses that are really too big. And the real problem with growing per capita housing space is that they're again get more expensive to operate, and they also fuel overconsumption. So when we look at the environmental and social problems, the economic problems involved with housing affordability and environmental sustainability, we find that both at policy kind of levels and amongst activists, there are what Francois and I have kind of described as three weak approaches. And the first is that people can get so understandably quite frustrated and just say, look, there's no point in focusing on changing housing because what we really need is system change. And our reason for thinking that that is a weak approach is that really it just kind of leads to paralysis. There's another kind of approach which involves noticing that there are certain ways that you could solve the problem, perhaps social housing, tiny houses, or people building their own houses out in the countryside. And this kind of silver bullet approach it becomes quite competitive. So people think there must be one really good way whereby this will drive all of the other degrowth changes. But we think that in actual fact, there are too many different approaches that altogether can accumulate and be joined together in powerful ways. And so that we would avoid shooting in all those different directions because we believe that leads to fragmentation, but as I say, draw them all together. And so that's our thinking that has really provided a framework for our book. And just before I go into that framework, that we've made a kind of short representative list here about what housing for degrowth means, and Francois will talk more about some of these strategies later. And they all need sort of qualification. So we've got renovation versus demolition, but not all buildings are suitable for renovation. So that everything needs to be contextualised. But right at the moment, for instance, in the book, we've got a very good chapter that follows a United Kingdom campaign by some social housing residents who wanted to keep their social housing rather than have it demolished by the state and then have to share a new building with some people who'd owned the homes and have some of their own social housing slashed in the process. So that's called renoviction. Now, deurbanising, that is shrinking the kind of size of cities and renaturalising or greening areas both on the outskirts and inside the cities is important, along with allowing people to build simple, eco-sustainable housing. In degrowth, in its simple living for all principle, very much supports redistribution of the kinds of housing that we've already got, so that those people who have got 2 houses can actually give a house to the homeless. So sharing dwellings, frugal innovation, Francois will talk more about, and low impact, small scale, decentralised and compact settlements are further ways to go. The book itself starts with this simple living for all as the main principle. And alongside the chapter that I did in that section on housing for growth, Francois has written a housing for degrowth chapter. And again, he's going to talk more about the themes in that. As for the rest of the topics, we have put them under various headings, and these are the social ones of housing justice, those involving more satisfactory housing under housing sufficiency, reducing demand, which is very obvious degrowth kind of direction. And then we draw back and look at how ecological housing and planning, that is more kind of like a neighbourhood perspective or a whole city perspective, needs to be part of the whole degrowth strategy. Section 6 is different from the other sections in that it's led by 2 chapters that we more or less solicited from contributors to unpack a controversy within the degrowth movement around tendencies towards urbanisation and tendencies towards decentralisation. So we've got a couple of chapters that argue from a planner's and also from a kind of political philosophy point of view that citification is really the way that degrowth should proceed. And then we've got 3 commentaries that argue a little bit more towards decentralisation. And finally, we put the kinds of changes, directions and strategies that are argued in the earlier parts of the book into a wider context in the final part, which is on anti-capitalist values and relationships. So I'll just go through some of the chapters to explain a little bit about the detail in each of the cases. Most of them look at case studies and build up reasons why degrowth is involved in each of the case studies, and also does a little bit of a critique about how things could be improved, and puts them into the context of how exemplary these particular case studies are, or how representative they are within an international context. So Francois is going to talk to you later a bit about Canter Crèche, which is a housing project that he's been involved with. And Ted Trainer from Australia wrote this particular chapter, which is not too dissimilar from Francois' example, except that Ted started his about probably before you were born. And this is a really well-known demonstration site in the southern coastline away from Sydney, one of the capitals in Australia. And there, Ted, a sociologist at the University of New South Wales, developed a house, a really, really simple house, and surrounded it with all different kinds of technologies that can be used in homes, and opened it up every weekend, and that's been going on for decades. Tash Virko talks about Christiania, and in particular the way that housing is redistributed in Christiania, because that's a really good example of a non-market way of distribution of housing. Christiania has about 1,000 people in it. It's a precinct in Copenhagen. I expect that probably most of you know about that. So I mentioned that one before. We've got a chapter in the housing justice section which is about housing struggles in Rome. And what's really interesting about this chapter is that rather than just characterising the housing struggles in Rome over the last several decades as working towards a right to the city, the researchers of this chapter have also noticed and observed that it's turned into a right to metabolism in the 21st century. So there are now housing struggles in Rome that are around zero cement, they're around energy poverty, and around residents wanting to have a say in the sources of the energy that they use in their homes, that they're renewable energies. And Claudio Cattaneo has written a chapter which draws parallels between politicised squatters and the ways in which their ways of living and what they want to prove by living that way have lots of parallels with degrowth. There's a chapter by April, who's a United States citizen, who when she was a student decided that to avoid having to get a mortgage, she would build herself a nice little tiny house. In the process, she found lots of problems with building and planning regulations, and she also became a bit disillusioned with the very individualistic nature of the tiny house movement, and ended up doing a master's thesis which was kind of a critique of tiny houses, and now is a landlord of a tiny house. So it's kind of a really nice circular enthusiasm around tiny houses as one way that we could pursue getting around the kinds of affordability issues that we have with housing, but also reflecting on some of the neo-colonial ways that tiny houses have developed. There are two chapters that illustrate examples from the Global South, and one is by the architect Wendy Christie and by a building advisor, John Salong. John lives in Vanuatu, and the chapter is on this Pacific island, which Pacific nation, which covers actually around over 90 islands.